Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. My name's Jack Ferguson, an evidence-based brand consultant, and I do this podcast for senior marketers. You're probably one if you're listening in, so that you can feel seen, get ideas for stakeholder management and persuasion, and talk strategy, because frankly, we just don't get the chance to do that enough, do we? We don't get a chance to talk strategy enough. I release an episode every week. Sometimes it's a solo episode like today. Sometimes I co-host an episode with another senior marketer. But today's a solo episode, and this is the 50th episode of Season 3 of the podcast. So I thought I would do a fun one and go through 50 lessons I learned from producing and releasing these last 50 episodes. The podcast in its entirety has done over 100 episodes, but I'm going to be talking about the lessons I've learned specifically from Season 3 and Episode 50. And this is the season when the podcast very much changed from an interview style to co-hosting and focused on marketers. So a few things have been different since those first two seasons. So thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to go through my 50 lessons. So lesson number 1 is I've learned to prioritize sustainability over flair. So I started this season with massive aspirations for storytelling. I'd ask AI to create a scenario for me and I'd speak to the problems in the scenario. I was trying to build characters from this scenario. It didn't work. It was too complex for me to pull it off. The storytelling was really difficult. So I had to move back to an episode that could stand on its own 2 feet. Every episode needs to be able to stand on its own 2 feet and not need the context of other episodes to know about characters and whatnot. It's just too complex. Lesson number 2 is to focus on the brand over trends. Now, as a brand strategist, you'd think I'd know better, but I did get sucked into trends, specifically short-form video trends. I did get a lot of views. I got about 100,000 views on YouTube, a lot of them driven from YouTube Shorts, but they weren't driving a whole lot of long-term engagement. And I just don't think short-form content really suits this brand that well. So I've scaled back on that short-form content. And I do say 3 to 4 minute videos on YouTube now and stay out of the Shorts feed because I just don't know if many people, I couldn't see any evidence that many people were moving from the Shorts feed to the long-term episodes. On that note, lesson 3 is you've got to get your distribution channels right. TikTok and Instagram didn't really work for me. YouTube Shorts got a lot of views, but didn't really work for me. So I've scaled right back on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, and YouTube is where I'm putting a lot of my effort now. Lesson number 4 is to focus on incremental improvement. It's important to continue to improve every episode. I've learned a lot about YouTube over the last, say, 50 episodes. And as the iterations increase, the view count keeps going up and up, which is very heartening. Lesson number 5 is that video is hard. So there's lighting, cameras, zooming, comfort, clothing. I mentioned this in episode 22, but there have been more issues since then. I did a lot of these podcasts when I co-hosted it with others in Airbnbs. One of the times that I did it, one of the couches was very uncomfortable to sit on. It was very hard to do 12 episodes on. Another time I zoomed in the cameras at different zooms, and what that meant was that one camera was grainier than the other when in post-production the video editor couldn't overcome that. Lesson number 6 is that thumbnails and headlines are vital on YouTube. It is hard for me to leave room for them mentally. Producing an episode is so much work. So then you get to the end of it and you're like, now I have to write a headline and thumbnails. A headline can take me up to 2 hours, but nobody clicks, nobody listens. Lesson number 7, podcasting is expensive. So I'm on track to spend probably about 20 grand a year on this podcast, from video editing to hiring of rooms, from the aggregators like Buzzsprout to even editing software. It's not cheap for a small consultancy like mine. Lesson number 8 is that audio discovery is really hard. Apple Podcasts and Spotify aren't the greatest platforms for discoverability. A lot of the podcast growth comes from people learning about the podcast elsewhere. Lesson number 9 is that marketers aren't necessarily happy with their jobs. You might be listening and you might not be overly happy with your job. Why do I say this? Because the episode's titled Why Your Marketing Job Feels Unsatisfying and Marketing to Your Boss, Let's Pull Teeth, were the 2 most downloaded episodes of this season. That says a lot, and I'm sorry that you're not enjoying your job. Lesson number 10 is when I was posting short form content, and I still do post a little bit, people told me to make sure I refer to the episode number and name in the comments of that, because they'd watch a clip on short form and then go, I want to watch more. And obviously this only happened occasionally, but they couldn't work out which episode it came from. So learn to put the episode number and name in the caption. Lesson number 11 is to utilize existing brand equity better. So in the headlines of episodes, I can certainly refer to other brands or other concepts so that people are familiar with something when they come across it. So let's say mention Coke and brand names, Pepsi, blah, blah, blah in the headline. It does drive more clicks. It does drive more engagement for the same episode behind the curtain. Lesson number 12 is that podcasting is a production. So it's not new to me to know this, but I do have to reiterate it that it's pre-production, production, and a post-production process. And even when I'm talking to other people about this, that gives people a better idea about what it actually takes to produce this. So I would always say, think of podcasting as a production, not as podcasting, because a lot of people think you just plug in a microphone and start talking and Bob's your uncle, and it's just not quite that easy. Lesson number 13, it's been a really useful augmentation for my sales process. So people interested in working with me will check out a few videos from the podcast to see how I come across. They didn't necessarily find me through the podcast, but it has augmented my sales process and made people more comfortable to work with me, which is very interesting. Lesson number 14 is that co-hosts have also found it a great way to augment their sales process. So I was told by someone who's been a co-host this season, someone was considering working with them. They were considering a couple of other providers as well. They listened to the episode on this podcast and it got that client over the line. So if someone does go and listen to a full episode of a podcast, it's a considerable amount of time to get to know someone. So I'm not surprised, but it is interesting to hear that from co-hosts. Lesson number 15 is there's not much feedback for podcasts. So you've mainly got to try and find out who your listeners are and do interviews with them. I will say that I had a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts recently from Emil Maria. Thank you, Emil. And it was a wonderful thing to read. You don't get a whole lot of this, but I was smiling from ear to ear when I read this. They said, such a great podcast full of insights, and I always learn from it. Jack is brilliant with interviews, and I thoroughly enjoy listening. Highly recommend to subscribe. Thank you very much. That meant a lot to me. And anyone else listening right now, if you are inclined, please leave the podcast a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It does make a huge difference. Lesson number 16 is it's hard to stay on topic when I'm co-hosting with someone else. So I need to make sure that we don't get too engrossed in the conversation, or at least that I have that awareness that we've got a topic that this episode is about and that we do need to keep coming back to that and not just wander off into the distance. Lesson number 17 is that the pre-production process is vital. So I will meet with co-hosts, I'll brainstorm stories, then pick out a theme from the collective stories we share, and it makes it so much easier when we go to record the episode that we've got a plan. Lesson number 18 is that I've learned that what helps make this podcast unique is the intersection between the co-host stories and my stories. The way in which our professional careers enmesh can't be replicated. That's what is unique. Lesson number 19 is this is meant to be a co-hosted podcast, some of the time anyway, yet because I have experience doing podcasts, I've done between this one and another one, I've probably done about 180 episodes now. My co-hosts don't generally have that experience, so there's always this frame that they will come into where it will feel more like an interview where I'm the one asking questions of them, and it won't really be 50-50. So this is one of the reasons why I do these solo episodes as well, so that you also get to hear from me directly. I've learned to understand what it means to invite someone onto the podcast. I'm used to doing this. It doesn't mean that someone else can just turn up and do it exactly the way I think it should be done. Lesson number 20 is that I batch production. So I'll batch a ton of recordings at once. It gives the co-host better bang for their buck. So because they turn up, we do it all in person, and they get multiple episodes done at a time. And then I'll do post-production afterwards. So as the podcast content is generally evergreen, there isn't much risk of anything going out of date when it goes live. Lesson number 21 is that brand's a fluid concept in the early days. So this podcast is released under the brand name The Push. All the brand principles still apply. Just because this is a podcast, it's still part of a brand. As I release more episodes and speak to more listeners, it's great to continue to update the brand and let it evolve. Lesson number 22 is that approaching co-hosts is actually like a sales process. So even though this podcast is well into the top 1% of podcasts for episodes released, so 99% of podcasts don't make it past episode 20. I have 50 for this season already as you listen to this. But it's not always a slam dunk for everyone I approach to co-host it still. And it does come with some nerves for other people, which I have learned to still be understanding of. Just because I've done it a few times before doesn't mean that it's not intimidating for someone else. Lesson number 23 was to accept help. I did try to do too much of it by myself, and it's very draining to do that. But now I have a video editor and I get help when I do production, and it's made a world of difference. Lesson number 24 on that note, though, podcasting does take a hell of a lot of mental energy. So I'll honestly say I don't think I could do this if I had a lot of other commitments. I run my business during the week and usually spend an entire day on the weekend every week on the podcast. Lesson number 25 is that my post-production routine has now become quite wild. So that involves audio editing, video editing, voiceover, copywriting, headline writing, graphic design, should I say. And post-production can be a very intense process and can take me hours per co-hosted episode, hours and hours. So I've had to plan for that time. Lesson number 26 is that this is the same process as any brand building process, right? Like I understand what this brand is, then I get better at the how. So I started this season thinking that this podcast would be for non-marketers. Joke's on me, because the only people listening to it are marketers. I've iterated it and updated the messaging accordingly. So I had to understand what it was, and then now I'm in a phase where I'm getting better at the how of what that is. Now I better understand that. Lesson number 27 is to not lose sight of objectives. So was my objective to get a lot of views, or is it to get more long-term views with people getting value and enjoying the content? I can assure you it's the latter. I've had to keep a better eye on that recently. Lesson number 28, the amount of skills that go into creating a podcast are immense, especially a video podcast. So I'm not new to audio podcasting, obviously, but I am relatively new to video podcasting. So what are some of those skills it takes? Well, you've got to sell the co-host spot to other people. You've got to get the lighting right. You've got to get the cameras right, the audio editing. There's operational processes. There is video editing. There's storytelling. There's copywriting. There's graphic design. And of course, hosting, which is a deceptively difficult skill within itself. On that point, lesson number 29 is that hosting is more than just turning up. So I need to be well rested, be comfortable, be unrushed. I'm a performer, and I should treat it like a performance, because it is a performance. And if I'm doing a huge amount of batching, like I was speaking about before, I remember I recorded 12 episodes with co-hosts in about a 24-hour period. And that's not easy. And I probably didn't get enough rest before one of those days, or before the second day, should I say. So I've learned that you really have to leave space for this if you're going to do an incredible job of it. But lesson 30 is that it's important to have fun hosting. So if I'm having fun, that will come across when you listen, I hope. It is a lot of work, but it's better to have fun while I'm doing it. Lesson number 31 is that a tech stack is necessary. So for this podcast, I use Otter AI for transcription. I will use Adobe Audition for the audio editing. I used to do a bit of the video editing myself with DaVinci Resolve. I now outsource that. I do use ChatGPT a little bit for help with some of the copywriting ideation. And I use Buzzsprout for distribution. So all these tools are necessary to create this podcast. I couldn't do it without them. Lesson number 32 is that art imitates life, and the only reason I can keep doing this podcast is because I keep having experiences. So it's been very helpful for me to continue to have my own experiences as a brand consultant that I can bring to the podcast, which I think is an issue that full-time podcasters can have, because they're not having new experiences that they can bring in and share with the audience. They're still pulling from the memory bank, and one day that just gets a bit dry. Lesson number 33 is that I was hit with the cold start syndrome again. So I can't count the amount of times that I've done ventures where I've started from scratch, but this felt a little bit like I was starting from scratch in certain areas, because there was a new audience, and I created a new YouTube channel for the podcast, a new TikTok channel, a new LinkedIn channel. And in those early stages, as you may yourself have experienced, it's really hard to get things moving. And the lack of social proof in the beginning makes it harder to move again. Everything's against you. So the cold start syndrome kind of sucks, but I hope I'm on the other side of that now. Lesson number 34, though, is if I don't stand behind it and promote it, why should others? So sometimes I'd do an episode, get everything done, all this work, get it live, and then I thought to myself, I cannot be bothered interacting with this on social media. I'm so sick of this. I'm going to just schedule it in and I ignore it. But why should others interact with it if I won't even interact with my own podcast just because I'm sick of the episode, 10 hours later. That's not supporting the podcast the way I should. So now I make sure I always interact. I always support it myself first before I ask anyone else to. Lesson number 35 is to look after your early listeners. So I'm very grateful to you for listening right now. So thank you very much. I do put a lot of effort in, and I do keep you in mind when I'm doing the hard yards. Lesson number 36 is to not rely on a co-host audience to bring in new listeners. It's not a new phenomenon for podcasters to think that they'll get some traction from the audience their co-host or guest will bring in. And yes, they sometimes do bring in an audience. And yes, there might be some incremental improvement in views or downloads for that episode. But the people that they bring in aren't necessarily there to listen to what the podcast is about. So they're there because the guest brought them there. And they aren't necessarily podcast listeners either. So they might listen to that one episode, but then they don't subscribe because that's not what they do. They know the guest, they were there to listen to them. They're not interested in what the push is. They're interested in the guest. Lesson number 37 is to make each episode amazing. And, this just goes back to basic product. It actually does reflect what the podcast is, which I do want to do a great job of. And that is the only way to sustainable growth, I feel, because why should you keep listening to it if it's not great? Lesson 38 is to make the pre-production process easier on the co-host. So before I would tell the co-host to come up with some interesting stories from their career, and then we can talk about them, compare them to mine, and then that gives us a theme for the episode. But it puts all the burden on them when I frame it like that. So now I just simply arrange a time to brainstorm together so they don't have to go away and do all the heavy cognitive lifting on their own. And we come up with some ideas from there, some stories, and get a theme confirmed. And I only really have to ask them for about 2 hours total time, the half an hour meeting, about an hour to record 2 episodes, chuck in half an hour just for incidentals. Lesson 39 is that podcast analytics still don't offer much insight. You see downloads, you see what platforms your podcast is getting downloaded on. So for me, Apple Podcasts is where a large chunk of my downloads come from. But as far as actionable information goes, it's quite lacking. And all my decisions have come from interviews and conversations I've had with listeners. They haven't come from any quantitative metric from any of the platforms, even YouTube. Lesson 40 is to do 2 podcast episodes per guest at once. So I've done up to 8 podcast episodes in a day with a co-host, and those were with Alex Urquhart. So sorry, Alex. Those were back, I think, episode 20 to 28 or something we did in a day. And I've learned that's too much. You think you're giving them bang for their buck because let's just do it all in one day, but that's quite an exhausting day, and it's quite hard to keep the energy up for that amount of time. So we just record 2 at a time now, and that can keep the energy high and gives them a bit more bang for their buck rather than just a 1 episode. But it's not so many that you kind of get sick of it by episode 7. Lesson 41 is to stay open to co-host feedback. So one of my co-hosts wanted to put money behind the episode. I worked with him to make great content that he wanted to promote, and I didn't really see this coming. So because I stayed open to it, he wanted to put money behind the episodes that I created, so advertising on YouTube, which was something I didn't see coming and was quite awesome. Lesson 42 is to stay human. So podcasting with a co-host is a pretty human experience. So regardless of the content, it's still the laughs, the jokes, all that type of thing that are my favourite part of the episode, and listeners have reflected this back to me. I've also made editorial decisions at times to leave in imperfections where I ask a question that I don't think was clearly answered, and I repeat the question if I didn't think it was answered. I'm being honest and not being rude or anything. And the audience, or you out there, you listeners, have given me feedback that you appreciate that. So it's less about a perfect message. Sometimes it's more about a genuine, respectful conversation that I'm having with the co-host. Lesson 43 is that make sure there are multiple reasons I'm doing the podcast. So if it was only for the commercial gains, I would be well behind at this point in time. But I do get to experience all the challenges of building a brand while doing this. And that gives me more empathy for my clients. And I can try things out here that clients probably won't let me try out. So there are a few reasons why I do this. I don't think one reason would be enough. It's so much work and takes so much resource. Lesson number 44 is to continue to improve my communication. So one of the benefits I also get from this is that I look at the transcripts of the podcast, and It's quite ugly to look at times, but I do get that opportunity to continue to reflect on how I communicate, which is something that a lot of us don't get. I have to do this every week, so I know how I sound. I know my little nuances, and I know that I say so a lot. And I don't think I'd be aware of that if I didn't have to do this every week and edit this and listen back and iterate and improve. It's one of the reasons why I would be reluctant to outsource the audio editing, because one of the benefits of the audio editing is that I do get to listen to the verbal tics or the filler words or the cadences that may be annoying to hear and be aware of them. Because just when I'm talking, I'm just talking. I'm not really analysing how I'm communicating. Lesson number 45 is that I'm convinced that all the commercial rewards, or most of the commercial rewards for hosting a podcast, are perhaps in the top, say, 0.01%. Which is both daunting and inspiring. So as I mentioned before, this is in the top 1% easily for number of podcasts released. But is it a huge podcast? No. Is it a hugely commercially successful podcast? No. But that is inspiring. So it is something that I can do where I get to chase mastery, and I don't really have to answer to someone. I theorize that as you get better at this, as you get better and better and better, the rewards actually scale with you getting better, as opposed to, let's say, if you're a nurse or you're a pharmacist or something, and let's say you get better and better and better and better at that job and you become amazing at it, the rewards or the compensation doesn't necessarily scale with your ability. You do get to the stage where the law of diminishing returns kicks in. As much as it's daunting that you need to be in a tiny fraction of podcasts to get a good return, it's also an opportunity to pursue mastery and to hopefully have rewards scale with your skill. Lesson number 46 is to remember to pay attention to the progress. So I'm someone who it's very easy to be in improvement mode all the time and to see the things that need improving, the things that could be better. But that's part of the game between this podcast and another podcast. As I said, I have hosted and produced about 200 episodes, or just short of that. And I feel like I know nothing, and that's okay. But I do know something, and some of those things I am sharing with you today. Lesson number 47 is a brand-related lesson. So this brand, and I'm not going to refer to it as a podcast right now, but this brand, The Push, needs a rename. I've had The Push for a very long time, and it was never named to work in 2025. I think it got named about 10 years ago. It's too generic and it needs a new name. So I will be renaming this in time so that it's less generic, it's easy to find, all the brand-related stuff that I know and I talk to you about. People search for The Push on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you can't find it. I saw there was another podcast on there as well the other day. It's something about birthing, and that sounded a bit more appropriate for The Push, a name called The Push. So I'll be renaming the brand in the near future. I will leave this name to the two lovely women who are running the Push podcast, which is about birthing. I don't anticipate I'll give birth anytime soon or be an expert on that topic anytime soon. So I will step aside, leave the name to them, and come up with something a bit more distinctive for this one. Stay tuned for that. Lesson number 48, brand again. So this brand needs a visual distinctive asset. I don't actually have one for it. As a brand strategist, the irony isn't lost on me. So this will be built soon. I will probably start with a name. If you want to know how this name came about and how this brand came about, I was working for a company 10, 12 years ago, I think it was, where I did community events for them on the side. And that was through a brand called the Pulse. So I worked with that company for about a year. I built the Pulse for about a year. That company cut their entire international team. Obviously, I was one of them to get cut, and the Pulse went with it. So I thought to myself, I kind of liked running those events. Maybe I'll just keep doing it, but I'll put it under another brand name and do it myself. So the Push was actually created really just to sound a lot like the Pulse. So people would associate it with that brand and I could continue on from where I left off. So that's the reason for the name. The reason I also just started publishing with this brand again is because it was already there. So I had, a website, I did have a name, I did have colors, and Buzzsprout was set up, and I had some social proof from old episodes and some reviews from old episodes. So it is something that I could just start releasing again and iterate as things changed. But yes, it needs a new name and it needs a visual distinctive asset. So coming in the near future. Lesson 49 is to make sure that I replicate the listening experience more. So I was listening to an episode in the car the other day, so in preparation for today's episode, and I noticed that the speaker in the car was rattling a bit when I spoke, and I thought, damn. And some of you might be listening to this in your car, and some of the time that speaker may be rattling, and that's because there's a little bit too much low EQ in the mix. So I've had to tone that back a bit, but it was a good reminder to make sure I listened to the podcast where listeners would be listening to it and through speakers that you may have. It's not a problem in all speakers, but in a car speaker, they tend to not be able to handle the low EQ like other speakers can. Lesson number 50, lucky last, is that the brand will become what it wants to become. So this is a personal belief I have about brands, but I do believe that brands, especially in the beginning, should not be forced. And you should respond to your audience or your customer. If you have a customer, in this case, it's an audience, and you put something out there, you get feedback, you have experiences, you iterate, you hone, you work out what you're going to compromise on. You realize what you're happy to be guided by the audience on, and you realize what you're actually not going to be guided by the audience from. And that, to me, is the magic of brand. It's impossible to implement all the feedback I get, and some of the feedback feels quote unquote off brand. But all feedback allows me to work out what is on and off brand and where those boundaries exist. I don't force the brand, I nurture it, I give it guidance. There's times where I make decisions where I feel I need to stick to brand DNA, even if I hadn't properly defined it before that point. I go down and jot that down and make sure that I have that recorded. But I also take on a lot of feedback from listeners. So thank you for sharing your feedback. I do implement a lot of it. I remember a quote from an event I was at a few years ago, a long time ago, probably 8 years ago, but it still sticks with me, is that good content will eventually find its audience. And I believe I'm seeing this more and more as this continues to grow. So to you, listener, thank you for tuning in. I don't take your attention for granted, and I aim to continue to bring you value as I can keep releasing more and more episodes. I'm going to change up a few things over the next, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 episodes or so. I'll try some things. It still will be, it's not going to be too radically different, but there'll be some new ideas coming to the party. So I hope we can have a lot of fun with that. Some of them might go well, some of them you might not like as much. Let's see how it goes. If you haven't already, please subscribe. I really appreciate that. And if you can leave a review, if you are getting value from listening in, please do. If you want to share feedback with me directly, just email me at jack@bethepush.com and I will definitely get back to you. Thank you very much for listening in. That's 50 podcast lessons from 50 episodes. That's all taken from season 3 of the Push podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.